As we all know, wherever you land in Warzone makes a big difference. Every location has pros and cons, with different tactics that you should be using in that area to get the most out of it. The point of this video is to provide an in-depth analysis of what it's like to land in Lumber. I'll be covering the playstyle I'd recommend when landing here, tips and tricks specific to this area, loot spawns, as well as rotations that you can make from here. I'll be providing a comprehensive review of this spot and leave you with my thoughts on it. If you want to see more of these videos, check the links in the description for more in-depth Warzone content. I just want to say that I'm primarily a solo Warzone player, so some of the tips given in this video will relate more to this mode than say trios or squads, but a lot of this content will be applicable to these modes, so it's worth sticking around here as I'm sure there's something for everyone. Moving on to the main body of this video, the first thing I want to discuss is what you can expect when you start landing here. Lumber is a unique place to land for quite a few reasons. It lies on the far east of the map, but despite its relatively far position in contrast to the rest of the map, it still somehow attracts quite a lot of attention. Given its relatively small size, compared to other regions like Storage Town or Superstore, you're more than likely to run into a few players here. If you're brand new to the game, this is not the ideal place to start off your Warzone experience. You're all but guaranteed to have to deal with at least one or two people. If you're in quads or trios, then this is an even bigger problem. It lies particularly close to farmland, which is, in my opinion, the main reason for this. This is very important as it affects the playstyle and tactics you should be using here, hence why I'm including it. The two are very similar in features and their sporadic layout. The lack of unity or logical setup of the two places mean that the lines between them are very blurred. Drawing an accurate distinction between where Lumber ends and farmland begins is quite challenging. As a result, you often encounter players/teams who will move between the two, often without thinking about it. This doesn't really happen anywhere else on the map. Say you're in Boneyard or Dam, then the boundaries of that location are fairly obvious. It's quite hard to accidentally go from Dam to military base and not realise you changed locations. It takes a conscious, psychological decision to move from one place to another. Whether it's to loot or to run from a team is besides the point. With Lumber and Farmland, this isn't really the case. The two are so similar that people move between the two quickly and without realising. This fluidity is great in terms of looting and whatnot, but it is something that you need to be prepared for. Rather than the static gameplay you might experience somewhere like Promenade, you encounter a lot of player movement here. Now the reason that understanding this is important is that you need to adjust your playstyle, like I mentioned earlier, in order to cope with it. Lumber's fluid layout makes this quite difficult to do, I'll be honest. This part of the map is dominated by large warehouses, machinery, the odd few houses, and also wood stacks. The smaller houses are easier to defend, which is a nice plus if you're waiting to surprise an enemy, but the dense mixture of objects in between all of the buildings around here actually makes moving between the structures a lot easier than it would normally be. Add this to the non-linear layout and you end up with a very challenging section of the map to manage, so I usually wouldn't recommend setting up shop in one of these smaller houses if you can help it. The other option you've got is the vast warehouses that are all about here. These offer multiple levels of cover, and the rule of thumb is that higher is always better. The first floor gangways and railings allow easy shooting down to the ground floor, but are also protected from the floor above. As a result, you're far more exposed on the bottom floor than you would normally be. If you're going into these buildings, you should be pretty careful, as you've got a much greater scope from which you can be targeted. You can access the roof of nearly every one of these warehouses, and this is grand for longer range engagements. They offer plenty of cover and are rather large, so you've got a lot of options if you get into a fight. Again though, these places aren't ideal, as they've got multiple access points, so managing them all is quite a challenge. I'd happily say it's all but impossible to hold one down as a solo player, as you just can't keep track of it all. Plus, the fact there's multiple of these buildings of the same height means you can easily encounter other players with the same advantages as you. This sort of stalemate is never a good thing. My overall opinion of this place is it's not somewhere that you want to spend too long in. It's easy to loot and move through, but far too difficult to hold down. Now you can take advantage of this early doors by pursuing scavenger contracts, as you'll find moving point to point relatively easy. If you need to farm up enough cash for loadout drop, then this can be a great option. Although ironically, I wouldn't recommend calling in a drop here if you can help it. It's just far too hard to keep an eye on all of your surroundings at once. An enemy could be right around the corner and you would literally never know. Instead, you should prioritise landing here and moving on pretty quickly, if that's an option. Continuing with the gameplay advice, I wanted to discuss the ideal method by which I'd land here. The best option I'd recommend for everyone is to avoid the main warehouses if you can possibly help it. Their size means they're a popular target, so if you want a quick firefight, then feel free to pick these. If you want more of a tactical advantage, then aim for the smaller houses littered about the outside of Lumber. I'd say the northernmost section of Lumber is far better option, as it isn't quite as dense as the rest of the area. You'll have less high ground to worry about, which is nice, especially early doors. Your other option is to land centrally and then work your way outwards. This carries a greater risk, but does mean you'll have more places to loot as a result. If you're not confident with a variety of weapons, then this is the course of action I'd recommend. Getting stuck with a gun that you're not confident with on the outskirts of Lumber is not going to end well for you. This does tie into loot though, which, although it is randomised, there's some general guiding principles that I can give you. Do bear in mind though that this doesn't mean that your experience will be the same as mine. From my general experience of this area, the large warehouses offer the best loot overall. They're full of different nooks and crannies that can contain all manner of resources for you. Plus their size means that there's a lot to go around. By the same token though, they're more likely to be dropped on by other players. It's a classic risk versus reward problem, so just play it to your preference. In terms of combat, I'd actually say this is one of the most balanced places on the map. The dense layout and large buildings actually make camping fairly difficult here. You can't hold the buildings as they're simply too big for individual players to manage. The tightly packed compact ground space also breaks up a lot of the lines of sight, again reducing the usable nature of what high ground there is. As well as this, the buildings themselves are relatively open, so there's a challenge in securing several individual rooms. In terms of actual combat, you'll find that short to medium range weapons dominate here. Assault rifles are more than ample for distant engagement, while SMGs are the first choice for any scraps inside buildings. One of the nicest facts about Lumber is that it feels like a very level playing field. Sure, if you're caught out in the open at a buy station, you'll get rinsed, but at the same time, the rest of the combat is fast paced and engaging, in a way that you don't really find at places like downtown, for instance. You need to have decent reactions, as you're probably going to happen across an enemy by chance due to the odd layout, as well as confidence with close range weapons for the same reason. A big factor for a lot of people is rotations and how you can make the most of the land around an area in order to get where you need to be. Lumber is no different, so I'm going to be explaining the routes and methods that I'd use to approach a variety of rings and scenarios. I wouldn't normally advise this sort of playstyle, but making use of vehicles is definitely advised in this location. It's relatively remote and quite far removed from the rest of the map. As a result, you'll usually need to cover a reasonable amount of distance, whichever direction you're going. The landscape around Lumber is generally quite sparse, with only a few trees and hills to offer you cover, although, as it does border the edge of the map, you never need to worry about moving east, which is nice. If you're heading over south or north, move out to this outer boundary early on in order to make your life much easier. Say you have a southwestern ring, then this is definitely the approach to take. Whether you use a vehicle or not is up to you. It just depends on how much you want to be stealthy at any point in time. I would absolutely not recommend going through farmland, as a fluid nature I've already mentioned means that you could well come across people here. Instead, stick to the eastern hills and try to skirt the area. From here, you can drop down to port and completely avoid the dreaded mess that is downtown. If you have a more western ring, or under time pressure, I'd still recommend this route if you can. If you're concerned with winning the game, avoiding downtown at all costs is my advice. The high buildings are paradise for snipers and campers alike. If you don't fancy heading south for some reason, head northwest to Stadium and use it as cover. Now for these routes, I'd advocate the use of a vehicle if you can. There's a massive stone estuary here that provides literally no cover to anyone. A vehicle will allow you to move through this as fast as possible, and should carry you out of range of downtown. If you're heading to a northern/northwestern ring, then your life couldn't be any easier. Stick to the Woodland Hills on the far east of the map, and your life will be easy. Plus, if you're a sniper, you'll find this to your liking, as there's few tall buildings around here, and a decent amount of cover for you. You can carry on as far as Quarry this way if needs be. It allows you to dictate exactly when you enter a more risky scenario, which is a big bonus. I would say though that if you need to move west, avoid Cast Bridge at all costs. It's an obvious point for teams to camp, and there's far too much cover either side for players to enjoy. Generally, Lumber is a place best suited to the southwestern or northern rings. Heading west is much harder than it needs to be here, as there's the dense mass of downtown in the way. If you're fancying kills, then again, head out that way, but for a tactical advantage that's just not the best option. If you have a ring that's directly over Lumber or partially south of it, you also have a few options. Holding down the buildings in Lumber itself is rather hard, like I've said. Instead, you'd be better suited to moving to the outskirts. Hills favour longer range players, while the edge buildings are better for closer range players. Again though, I would reiterate that holding down Lumber is a significant challenge. Securing single floor of a warehouse or residential building will make your life easier, but at least everyone will be in the same boat if Lumber is the final ring. Lumber can be very good in some specific situations. If you need to head to a northern ring, it's a great option. There's plenty of loot to go around and travelling this way can be easy. The same is true of southwestern rings, and the routes you can take are safe and easy again. But the problem is that western rings are a big issue. You'll be forced to move between densely populated areas if you have to go this way. If you're forced up to Stadium, you need to circle a giant structure that takes up a lot of your time. You can't cut through it, and circling it can leave you far too exposed. Cutting between downtown and Stadium with a vehicle is an option, but this is far from the stealthy approach most people favour, and as such, it's not one that I'd recommend. The fact that it's hard to defend as well means that it isn't even a good option if the ring is right over it. Lumber is at its best, uniquely, when it's outside of a ring. You can enjoy a reasonably quiet drop and loot up no trouble, and not spend too long here. It's best viewed as a pit stop in my opinion, a place to acquire loot and leave behind. It's just too difficult to defend and too exposed for a lot of situations. Now this is just my opinion, and if you have a love for this style of combat here, then go for it. I just wouldn't recommend it overall.